I'd like to welcome you to the CILR JTeach.ca webinar, Exploring Israel's Legal Rights to the Land of Israel. This is part 2, and this webinar focuses a little bit more on on the aspect of teaching the information, and we're going to be going over different ways that you can relay the information to your audience, whether that be a classroom or a group of interested learners or even some friends. It'll be a little bit different for us. So as we get started now, we're going to hear some words from the founder and co-chair of Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights, Goldie Steiner. Goldie, please go ahead. Oh. It would appear that Goldie has us on hold. All right, so I think Goldie's going to join us as she can. For the moment, we'll move ahead and we'll start looking at our content. So I want to remind everybody that this information is all based upon the book, The Jewish People's Rights to the Land of Israel by Salomon Benzimra. Salomon was a very strong supporter of Israel's legal rights and did extensive research on the documents that lead us to see factually that the land of Israel, the land that Israel occupies, is indeed not an occupation, it's an ownership. We're looking at everything from a factual and a legal and a logical perspective. It's not particularly from a political perspective. Our documents or the significant events that we looked at during part 1 of the 2-part series were the Balfour Declaration, where there was support from the British government, from Britain, for the establishment of a legal land, a legal home for the Jewish people in the area which was known as Palestine. And that was further followed up at the San Remo Conference, where 52 members of the League of Nations voted to make that into law. And then that was followed up again by the Mandate for Palestine, where Britain was given the mandate to actually keep that land in trust for the Jewish people, which they eventually handed over in 1948. So what we're going to look at today is based upon a teacher's guide and lesson plans that were developed by Yehudi Shire-Weisberg, who is, unfortunately, she lives in Israel, and this was, when it's going on at 7 o'clock here, it's going on at about 2 in the morning over there, so it's rather late for her. So she couldn't be with us, but she certainly welcomes and is willing to take feedback if anyone at the end of this wants to look at certain aspects of the lesson plans, which will be made available to you upon request. I've got the information at the end of the webinar, so if you want to send Goldie an email and ask her to send you a copy, she'll be more than happy to do so. And Yehudi has indicated as well that she's more than open to feedback from people and would like to hear what other people's thoughts are on the lesson plans. Going into the lessons themselves, I have to make a mention, and I have to say that I, just like any other teacher would do, because that's really what I am at heart as a teacher. So I would actually, when I look at a lesson plan, I adapt it to my own needs. I make it match my teaching style. I look at my audience and I'll adapt it to my audience as well. There's a saying that we have to know our learners. And I think that applies in any situation. We do have to know our learners regardless of who those learners are or where they come from. So it's very important that in anything that you're teaching, become familiar with the material, but when you're actually trying to relay it to other people, relay it from a place of knowledge. Let people know that. By the same token, don't be afraid to say, I don't know. If there's something that you're talking about and someone asks you a question and you don't know the answer, there's nothing wrong with telling people that you don't know the answer. Offer to look it up or to work on it with them, or invite them to look it up and get back to you. Whatever way works for you, depending on your audience. Again, that's perfectly fine. So the first lesson that we're going to look at, the first lesson is obviously lesson number 1. Lesson number 1 is a little It's more of an introduction, and we're going to look at the progression that you might take in a classroom setting, but you can apply this in other settings as well. And what I've done is chosen lesson number 1 to go through, and then I've also chosen to look at lesson number 4. And the reason why I chose the 2 lessons is just to give a varied idea of the approach that you can take. I didn't necessarily pick the lessons because I find one better than the other. I just wanted to have a couple of examples. In the actual package, there are 16 lesson plans that all deal with different aspects of the book. Some of them can be presented as standalone lessons, but obviously when you're dealing with a unit of study, it's probably better to do them all together so that one builds upon the other. But as long as you do the right preparatory work and as long as you lay that foundation with your audience, then you should be able to pull any lesson out of there and use it in order to get a point across, if not all of the points across. So we're going to look at, and one of the things that we like to do in the classroom is we like to make sure that there's clear goals. So today's goal would be something that I would tell my students that I would put on a board, and I would say that today's goal. So we're going to, in this lesson, lesson number 1, we're going to look at defining what a lie is. We're going to look at defining anti-Semitism, and we're going to look at defining anti-Zionism. So those are the goals of the lesson. Now, we also have an agenda for the day because you want to give the students, you want to give your audience a little bit of a roadmap. You don't want them to feel lost in where you're going. So we're going to look at lies and truths. We're going to look at Zionism and anti-Zionism. We're going to look at anti-Semitism. And then we're going to look at the question of whether anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism. Because for a lot of people, they don't understand that particular point. And the success criteria is another thing that we put down so that you know and we know if you're understanding what's happening. So the SWBT is shorthand in schools for students will be able to. So there's different forms that people will use or teachers will use to get that point across and make sure that they're able to do it. So by the end of the lesson, students should be able to describe the contents of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, IHRA being the International Holocaust Association, sorry, I'm messing up the definition, and recognize and understand why anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism. So before we go further, I'm just going to invite Goldie to come on because Agnes has managed to help her get on there. So I'm going to activate her microphone and we're just going to hear a little intro from Goldie. Hi Goldie, how are you?
I'm okay. Can you hear me?
I can hear you definitely, and I'm hoping everyone else can as well.
Okay, good.
So we're going to pause right here, and I'm going to, we continued a little bit ahead while we were trying to iron out those technical difficulties, but I think we've got that managed now. So please, we're eagerly awaiting your introduction.
You want me to go now?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you for joining us, everybody. Some of you who participated in our first session know me by now. Tonight you will be treated to an in-depth educational experience about Israel's legal rights. The lesson plans, the teacher's guide, and the student's handbook, the package, are all the product of Yehudit Shire Weisberg's hard work, on which she spent unimaginable amount of time. It was really a labor of love. This will be delivered to you by Corey Margolis, co-chair of Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights Education Committee and founder of JTeach.ca. Corey is CILR's newly found partner. When I say newly found, I mean that he is truly a treasured find, which you will soon experience for yourselves. We live in peculiar times, and I don't mean the COVID-19 alone. We often are under attack, as well as being denied of being owners of our land and not occupiers. For more on this subject, please go to Mark Vandermaas's Land Rights Training web page, which will be posted at the end of the session on your screen. Recently, the validity of the San Remo resolution was called into question. Is it lack of education? Is it misinformation? Or is it simply ill-spirited accusations? No matter whether one or the other, or actual conviction, our task is to cut out, and especially you who are educators, we must follow our own path, which is to bring facts and truths to the fore and educate students so they can educate others. A role no one can feel better than educators. And Corey, back to you.
Thank you, Goldie. Thank you so much. I'm glad we were able to connect and get that input. So we're going to forge ahead, and we're going to continue with our lesson. And so here is our next. So we went over the agenda. We look at the success criteria, and we're going to start into the lesson. It's usually a good idea to start a lesson or any kind of educational endeavor with a hook. And in this case, we're going to say, make the lie big, keep it simple, keep saying it, and eventually they believe it. We want the audience to start thinking about what our topic is. And in this case, we're introducing what is a lie. And if we reveal where this comes from, which was actually Joseph Goebbels, who was Adolf Hitler's propaganda minister in Nazi Germany, we see that this is not something to admire. Rather, it is something that is put together by someone who actually perpetrated a horrible deed. So, you know, when we say that when people are lying, we can have a discussion and ask the group what they think about this, or we can simply present it to them as an example of the process that that people go through in order to get others to believe what they want. This is an example that's been around for a little while, but we're going to play this very quickly for those of you who haven't seen it. Again, it's another jumping off point, a great point for discussion.
As night falls, 37 million Canadians turn out their lights and settle down for the night. But as we sleep, there's something interesting going on. House hippos have returned to Canadian homes, but they're extremely hard to spot. They enjoy admiring their reflections, hoarding socks, helping themselves to your devices, and annoying your pets. It looks like Canada has a house hippo problem.
Or do we? We brought back the house hippo to show how easy it is to be fooled in our digital world. Find out how to tell what's real and what's not at breakthefake.ca.
All right, so this obviously is not anything to do with land rights in Israel and defending them, but it's a great example for the students to draw them into a discussion and get them to realize that it's so easy to perpetrate a lie, especially these days when we have technology involved, to show people something that's supposedly a truth when it's completely not true. You know, I mean, they've developed a whole program on this. It's actually part of the curriculum in schools. Critical thinking, media literacy is part of English courses to understand what's going on, how to dissect it, how to diagnose what's happening in the media, using your brain, figuring out, using multiple sources, who's credible and who's not. I mean, these are all parts of things that we teach in the classroom in any case, and these are all things that people should be doing on a general basis. Often, way too often, people just agree with things because it's a friend who tells them, or because it's someone who's in a position of authority, and they don't really take that extra step to think for themselves. So we want them to be critical. We want them to analyze things and look at things from the perspective of, is this really true? Is this a truth or is it not? So one of the activities that you can do if you're presenting or if you're talking with such a group where you have the opportunity to do activities is, and in a classroom, it's always a very good idea to break things up and not just talk at the class because it keeps people involved, it keeps them interested. You can break your classroom up into groups of 4. tell them that they're going to discuss what their definition of a lie is. And while they're beginning to make their conversations, or even beforehand, you can put chart paper down on some of the desks and markers and ask each group to write down their definition. While they're doing that, once they're done with that, you put the papers up on the wall and you do a little bit of a gallery walk. A gallery walk is what it sounds like in the art world, where you walk from painting to painting, in this case from poster to poster, and you spend a couple of minutes at each poster, and then the group can discuss it amongst themselves and what they think of other groups' definitions, what they've come up with. Now, you could lead a short discussion, a class discussion on this, and come to a consensus, which the teacher would write on the board or the whiteboard in the front of the class, or these days when everything's being done over Zoom, could put it on the video, could type it up in the message board, and then everybody would have that definition to work with. It really helps to frame things before you start discussing serious issues, and it's a critical part of the process. So we, of course, want to tie things into Israel, and we can say that, is there anything said about Israel that qualifies as a lie? Now, the students might not know. They may know, they may not know. They may have some suggestions. So I wanted to frame something in a way in which it gives them, it leads them to a response. It's not just a yes or no. So if I would say to them, would it surprise you to learn that the following statements are not true, that Israel stole Palestinian lands, and if you were part of the previous seminar, you know that that wasn't. We're going to actually reinforce that in this lesson, how it's not true that Israel stole Palestinian lands. We know that Israel is not an apartheid state. It's the only democracy in the Middle East, the only true democracy. And again, not true. The West Bank is occupied Palestinian territory. In order for it to be occupied Palestinian territory, we would have had to establish that it was Palestinian territory to begin with, which again, there are historical and factual data that indicate that it's just simply not true. So if the statements you heard are not true, why do so many accept them as such? So as we are talking and as we are looking at this, we can see that there are many different viewpoints that are going to come up. There are many different situations that are going to come up. There's many different ways of answering the questions. None of them are simple. Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry, I just went forward accidentally. So many of them are simple, they're not simple, I should say. There's not a one good answer or one true answer, and the answers are going to vary from the students. And the truth is that there are different answers available. I mean, some of them would be that we tend to be too trusting as individuals, and we trust those. If it's in a newspaper, we trust it. If a friend tells us, we trust it. If it's something that's in social media, we tend to accept it. So it's very easy for us to accept it. I mean, there are other reasons as well, but many of those conversations that you're going to have in response to this statement are going to be comments and conversations that are not easy conversations to have, but they're also going to rely upon you doing your homework if you're leading it and being able to answer these questions. So what is the best way to answer this false thinking? And that is really to teach them to be critical thinkers, to teach them to seek out and understand that just because something is said, it doesn't mean it's true. And just because it's a big lie and repeated often doesn't mean we should believe it, right? We want to counter what Goebbels says, and we don't want to be the sheep that are following the shepherd just because they're a shepherd and not thinking for ourselves. So there's a couple of questions that need to be answered again in the background information. We can't talk about anti-Zionism. We can't talk about anti-Semitism in connection with anti-Zionism in Israel if we don't define things. So we ask of our students, and we ask of our audience, and we ask them to think about what is Zionism. So many people are so quick to say Zionism is wrong. Zionism is taking things from other people. It's doing a bad thing, but they don't really know what a definition of anti-Zionism is. And the definition I chose to put up here is not anything that's particularly complex. It's not anything that's even deeply involved. It's simply a dictionary definition, and it's from Merriam-Webster Dictionary. So it's an international movement originally for the establishment of a Jewish national or religious community in Palestine, and later for the support of modern Israel. That's it. Zionism just means it's a bunch of people who want to live safely and securely in their own homeland, just as any other nation does on the planet. It doesn't say we want to persecute anyone. It doesn't say we want to target anyone. It doesn't say we want to steal the land from anyone. It says we just want to. And at the time when Herzl and his peers were seeking to connect, or seeking to, the word I'm looking for is reestablish the Jewish community and the Jewish state of Israel. And it was that reestablished point that is important, because it goes back thousands of years, despite what some might say. So if we have Zionism, then what's anti-Zionism? So anti-Zionism is the opposition to the establishment or support of the state of Israel. Obviously, it's opposition to Zionism. But if you think about it, opposition, anti-Zionism, it means that people are opposing the establishment of a Jewish national or religious community in Palestine. There was never any question of whether it would be somewhere else. Well, there was question at one point of whether or not when the Mandate for Palestine was being put together and they were figuring out where to establish the Jewish homeland, there was a suggestion at some point that there would be a place in Africa where they might establish Jewish homeland. But of course, the Zionists were very against that, because Israel is our ancestral homeland. And that was, I mean, without a question, that was the area where we wanted to be. But so it's saying that, you know, it's not just we're against people having a homeland. It's not just it's against, specifically against the establishment of a Jewish national or religious homeland. So that's pretty significant when we're looking at these things, when we're talking about them. So what is anti-Semitism then? If we're talking about anti-Zionism and Zionism, and we want to talk about anti-Semitism, we need to frame it in a way. And fortunately, it's unfortunate that it was necessary, but fortunately, there's an organization, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, that was formed by a multinational group, and they came up with a definition, a working definition of anti-Semitism. So here we see the IHRA, IRA, is the only intergovernmental organization mandated to focus solely on Holocaust-related issues. You know, Holocaust is a whole other bag of issues, but that's really how this came about and how this definition. The important thing for our purposes isn't specifically the issues surrounding the Holocaust, but it's the issues surrounding anti-Semitism at this point. So IRA experts determined that in order to begin to address the problem of anti-Semitism, there must be clarity about what anti-Semitism is. How do we start talking about a problem? How do we start identifying a problem if we don't come up with a common understanding of what that means? If we spend all our time arguing about this aspect is and that aspect is not, and this piece is and this piece is not, then we start to go into territory where it's easy for people who don't want to engage in the conversation to distract from the conversation. So when the IHRA came together and formed this definition on anti-Semitism, it was a huge thing for the world, and it's fairly recent. So we see further that the IHRA's Committee on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial worked to build international consensus. We, as a nation, Canada has actually signed on to this definition, this working definition. And there's a working definition of anti-Semitism, and that was subsequently adopted by the plenary and put out to the world at large. And we hear more and more about other nations, states, provinces, territories that are signing on and agree to abide and go by this working definition of anti-Semitism. So, you know, it's really important. Now, it's kind of wordy what we're looking at. You might lose your audience a bit when we start talking about this, because I have several slides where we're going to talk about details of what anti-Semitism is according to the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. And here's just an example of how you might keep your audience with you. You could actually hand out sheets And if we look at the previous slide, I'm going to show you it again. If you look at the previous slide, and then you look at this slide, they're the same slide, but I've removed some words. Now, the idea is to give them the information because you don't want your audience to be sitting there, especially if it's a classroom setting. You don't want them to be sitting there just writing frantically to try to get all the words they're saying, and you don't want them spending all the time trying to read what's on your screen. So by leaving certain words out, they have to pay enough attention so they can fill those in to keep their notes, but they don't have to struggle to keep notes for everything that's being said. And for those of you who can remember back or to your university days or your college days or even your high school days, when you didn't have anything to keep up with and you only had a teacher talking at you and you were frantically trying to scribble down notes, it was very hard to absorb the information. So the idea here is to have your audience be able to absorb the information, but still have to focus enough and reinforce their learning by actually writing some of the terms down. So this is just an example of one of those ways that you might introduce a better way of learning when you're throwing a whole bunch of words up on the screen. All right, so to continue, we're going to go over the definition that the plenary accepted. Now, this happened in Bucharest in 2016. Remember, I said this was fairly recent history. So we're looking at May 26, 2016, and the definition of anti-Semitism is such. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, towards Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Now, if it's got a tone of hatred in it and it's directed towards non-Jews, it's still considered anti-Semitism. It's still an attack on the Jewish people. So, we want the students to start thinking about this and start thinking about, what did I think about when I thought about the definition of Zionism? And now what am I thinking about when I'm looking at the definition of anti-Semitism? There are connections here, and they're important connections. They're things that we want the students to take in and learn, and we want them to be making those connections. We're not taking them by the hand yet. We're giving them the information that they need to make the connections, and we hopefully by the end of the lesson, they will make those connections, but we're going to help them to make those connections as we get further into the lesson. There are a lot of small details and examples that the plenary from IRA have given that tell us what anti-Semitism is, how it can be interpreted, which is great because, again, it's easy to read a statement. It's easy to read a position that's put out there, but people will pick apart details and they'll say, just as when we looked at the Balfour Declaration, we looked at, one of the things that came up was the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and people argued, well, it didn't say a Jewish state, it said Jewish homeland, and it didn't say in all of Palestine, it just said in Palestine. Well, these are just semantics, and the meaning and the intent was there. We know from follow-up meetings and conversations and recordings, transcriptions of conversations, that indeed it did mean a Jewish state, indeed it did mean in all of Palestine. So what they have done here, what the IHRA has done, is try and remove ambiguity from their statement and make it clear what they're talking about. So when we look at this, we see that manifestations can be the targeting of the state of Israel conceived as a Jewish collective. So they follow up by saying, however, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. I think that anyone who supports Israel and supports who they are, what they do, what they represent, will say that, listen, we're not saying that anti-Semitism, all anti-Zionism, or all criticism, I should say, of the Israeli government is anti-Semitism. It's actually, the truth of the matter is that the truth of the matter is that it's criticism of Israel because it's a Jewish state that makes it anti-Semitism, and that's where the anti-Zionism is important. So, anti-Semitism frequently charges Jews with conspiring to harm humanity, often used to blame Jews for why things go wrong. It's expressed in speech, writing, visual forms of action, and employs sinister stereotypes and negative character traits. Okay, so here's some contemporary examples which we look at. So these happen in public life, in schools, in the workplace, the religious sphere. So it's calling for aiding or justifying the killing or harming of Jews in the name of radical ideology or an extremist views of religion, making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations about Jews as such, or the power of Jews as collective, such as especially but not exclusively the myth about a world Jewish conspiracy, or of Jews controlling the media, economy, government, or other societal institutions. Okay, so we go on to list multiple reasons or multiple situations in when we can consider it to be anti-Semitism. So if we look here, accusing the Jews as a people or Israel as a state of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust, now we're getting into the area of anti-Zionism. And then talking about the fact denying the Jewish people their right of self-determination by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor, that's an attack on the Jewish state. That's an attack on Israel simply because they are Jewish, and not because they are looking at Israel as a state and criticizing political decisions. And then, of course, applying double standards by requiring of it a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation, which if we pay attention to the world, if we pay attention to the news, we see time and time again, nations are accusing or demanding things of Israel that aren't demanded in other countries. And that, according to falls under the definition of anti-Semitism. Okay, so the last one that I mentioned is holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the state of Israel. And just like, all people in the world who are Italian are not responsible for whatever the Italian government does, all people who are French are not responsible for what the French government does. All Jews are not responsible for the actions of the state of Israel, government decisions. When you say that, when you say they are, then you venture into the realm of anti-Semitism. All right, so we also know that anti-Semitic acts are criminal when they're defined by law. So in some areas, when you distribute denial of the Holocaust material or anti-Semitic materials, that is considered illegal, right? And when they target property, when they deal with destruction, places of worship, cemeteries, because these places are or perceived to be Jewish or linked to Jews, these are criminal acts as well. And then the denial to Jews of opportunities or services available to others is also illegal in many countries. And that falls under human rights issues. So we see there is a test, Natan Sharansky, who was a refusenik, someone who asked to leave the former Soviet Republic, and he was thrown in jail for quite some time before he was finally released. And he did manage to immigrate to Israel. And he actually came up with the 3 Ds the 3D test of anti-Semitism that he puts forth. So the 3 Ds actually stand for delegitimization of Israel. If someone seeks to delegitimize Israel, then we're venturing from the realm of it, that becomes anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism. If they're demonizing Israel, where they simply want to put Israel in the position, they want people to understand Israel as, people who are demons, then we're talking about, again, anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism represented as anti-Zionism. And then subjecting Israel to double standards, just like we said, the IHRA put in there, when you want to subject Israel to a double standard, to adhere them to a level of behavior that you don't impose on other democratic countries around the world, then that again is demonstrating anti-Semitism through anti-Zionism. So these are the 3Ds. So, you know, you might want to ask at this point, it's perfectly legitimate to have a conversation and say, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? Does it equal anti-Semitism? Again, the discussion will vary. It depends on your audience. It depends on the group. Hopefully you can get people involved in this at this stage. Hopefully you'll have people participating. Or you may have to reiterate the reasons why anti-Zionism is definitely the new form of anti-Semitism. And you want to make sure that people understand that this is not just some flippant you know, remarks that you're making. This is actually the truth of the matter. So there's a whole complex issue that needs to be understood. There's a foundation that needs to be laid before you can be teaching these things. You know, and we get support from all sides, just as we get criticism from all sides. Here's a quote. It says, when people criticize Zionists, they mean Jews. You're talking anti-Semitism. You know, this is actually a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King, who it was reported on. He said this to one of his own followers at a dinner who made an anti-Semitic comment, and he pretty much told him, you know, to shut it down. It's not acceptable. So, you know, when we talk about peace, when we talk about getting along with people, there are people out there that certainly, well, unfortunately no longer out there, but, you know, there's always people out there who are willing to talk, who are willing to get along and willing to discuss things from a logical, factual perspective. But for some reason that keeps getting shut down when it comes to really important issues like the Jewish people's rights to the land of Israel. You know, when we hear from people around the world, like the former chief rabbi of England, you know, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, who said, and he's said multiple occasions, that anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism. You know, it's not just enough anymore. People can't just say that. You know, they realize that they're sort of treading on fragile ground when they say we should hate the Jews because they're Jews. It's much more easier to attack the policies of a country, of a state where there's conflict, and connect their own anti-Semitic ideology to it than it is to directly criticize people just for being Jewish. Not that that doesn't happen these days. We see plenty of it, but this is the new form that it's taken because people have found a lot more accepted, outward acceptance around the world of the criticism of Israel and the criticism of Zionism as a whole. So, you know, the last thing you want to do when you leave a class is make sure that your students, or even with a group or audience, you want some feedback. So what we like to do in the classrooms is we essentially do what we call an exit ticket. Very often it can take many different forms, and this is the example at the end of one lesson, but I have the example at the end of another lesson. And this is very simple. In the space provided, write 1 or 2 sentences describing something new that you learned about anti-Semitism. You give one of these, it would most likely be a half sheet of paper to each student. They fill it out, they hand it to you on the way out the door. You get an understanding of what they've taken in, what they've absorbed, what you've covered, and what you still need to cover. So it's a very effective way of covering, you know, the information. I just want to point out as well that you know, you obviously you can do summative assessments. You can assess that. I mean, it's very easy to give a test or a quiz. And at some point, if you're using this in a teaching unit in the classroom, obviously you want to make sure that the students are retaining the information, they're achieving some form of mastery over the subject matter, and according to the curriculum standards that are applied to the lesson, you want to be able to give them a formative or summative assessment, which actually counts for grades. And whether that's in the form, again, like I said, a project, a quiz, it could be part of their final exam as well. Because if it's part of their material, then it's perfectly legitimate to test it within the classroom. So in a history classroom, this would be something that you would use in the history classroom. So that essentially covers the material in lesson 1 that was in the that is actually in Yehudit's lesson plans. I simply just put it in a form of having it presented to you and how you may present it to the classroom. So the content is there. And then now we're going to go on to the next lesson. And that next lesson is we're going to look at the fourth lesson actually in the series. So we're going to look at how the dangers of having a revision of history. So now that we've established, what a lie is and how those certain lies were put in place and certain untruths were put in place about Israel and about the Jewish people, and that we see that there is the existence of anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, and that anti-Semitism plays a big part in this, and that we really need to look at those facts, and we really need to look at that logic and that information when we're looking at it, the rights of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. And I want to remind everyone that really what we're looking at, not only are these, what we're talking about now is based on the lessons from Yehudi Shire-Weisberg, but it's also, again, I'm going to remind you, it's coming from the information gathered by Salomon Benzimra in the book, The Jewish People's Rights to the Land of Israel, which is available on Amazon and through Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights. And I have a slide at the end with the information that you're going to need in order to find it. So there's the information, Yehudi based her lessons out of this, and I based the PowerPoint off Yehudi's lessons. So everything ties back into the book and into the research and writings done by Salomon Benzimra. So we have to make sure that we understand those things. So if we look at History Revised, one of the sections of the book and one of the lessons that Yehudi has actually put together for us is that there is an issue with the world believing claims that are untrue. So what's the goal then of this lesson? So this lesson would be something that examines claims without proof. It's easy to say something. It's easy to tell a big lie and tell it often until someone believes it. If you scream loud enough, then you're going to be heard. But that doesn't mean that we need to accept whatever we hear just because someone screamed it loudly. And we also need to recognize truth in history. There's evidence all around us, and we should be able to find that evidence. We should be investigating and searching for it, especially when it's on big issues that affect millions of people. So these are two goals that we can look at for the fourth lesson. So the agenda, we're going to look at how revising history can happen. We're going to look at archaeological evidence, and then we're going to look at from the mouths of, so we're going to look at statements made and that were contradictory to other statements when we're looking for proof. One of the things that we want to look for when we're looking for proof is consistency. So if we find that inconsistency, then that's usually an indication that there is actually something that's not true or a lie being told. So how do we measure our success criteria? We look to history to establish the validity of a claim. If we can do that, if we can do our research and find the validity of a claim, then we've learned what we need to learn. We examine the recorded evidence presented by a group to establish validity. Again, we look at both sides of an argument. We see what there is in the past, what their pattern is, and we try to determine and establish, is this the truth? So, like I mentioned for the first lesson, we want to, do some conversation. We want to bring them into it. We want to bring the students into it, the audience into it. So I'm showing you an image, and you might say to yourselves, what does this have to do with proving validity or establishing validity of the arguments in that the Jews were in Israel for thousands of years, and countering the claim of others who would say that they've only been there in recent history, and it's the Jews that are lying, and it's a Zionist conspiracy that the Jews were actually settlers and indigenous to the land of Israel, going back thousands and thousands of years. Here we see a 7,000-seat Roman Colosseum that was dug up and retrieved archaeologically. It's in an area that the Romans referred to as Scythopolis. What's interesting about this area and why this is important and why this should generate some conversation among students is the fact that this actual Roman Colosseum actually is in the area of Beit Shan in Israel. So the Romans were occupying Israel and were in Israel, and they actually built a Colosseum there. Now, again, you might say, well, how does this prove anything? And I'm going to show you something further in the lesson that actually connects to the Romans and their presence in Israel and the proof of the Jews being in Israel because the Romans were there and the Romans identify the Jews as being living in Israel and as having been the government in Israel. So in spite of archaeological findings and historical records, there are many Arabs and Muslims today that deny the Jewish temples in Jerusalem existed, and they try to portray Jews as newcomers to the land of Israel. Now, I have to say that these are mostly those who are consider themselves Palestinians, who have been told they're Palestinians in many cases, who have accepted it without doing the research and looking at it critically. But it's mostly the people who want to live there who obviously would say this, because you have to justify your desire to go somewhere if there's someone there already. So in August of 2009, Sheikh Taysir al-Tamimi, he was the chief Islamic judge of the Palestinian Authority, and he stated, Jerusalem is an Arab and Islamic city, and it has always been so. Says there's no evidence that Jews had a history or presence in Jerusalem or that their ostensible temple had ever existence. There's a massive archaeological dig in Israel and Jerusalem that has unearthed significant portions of the temple wall and the temple and the city that was surrounding it, the city of David, and the cisterns underneath that the Romans built, that the temple walls were there. I mean, there's all kinds of history there that's irrefutable. Simply make a statement like this is really obviously ridiculous, and it obviously has an agenda of taking over Israel from the Jewish people. And it's this particular person, is one of many who has that agenda in mind. They don't want to believe the evidence. They don't want to look at the evidence. They simply want to make a statement, and they feel that everyone will accept it as a truth because they're saying it, which, if we're teaching our students, if we're teaching ourselves how to look at things critically, we know very well that this is not the way to do things. So I mentioned that there was a connection with the Romans back to the Jewish people. Archaeology actually provides proof that the Jewish people existed in Israel. So far back in history, so the Arch of Titus, which we see here, it's an arch that's in Rome. It was made after 81 Common Era. It's this marble arch with huge panels in it. Well, one of the panels actually shows the Romans bringing back spoils from the temple in Jerusalem, and you can clearly see that they're holding a menorah in there, and they hold objects from the temple. They celebrated the success of defeating the Jewish people in Israel back in, in the 1st and 2nd century. And as a matter of fact, the emperor in Rome at the time, he actually renamed the land Israel in order to erase the connection between the Jewish people and their homeland. So, and we know this going back in history, we see that in records. And once the Roman emperor became Christian, because we know that they worshiped many gods beforehand, and then the Roman emperor became Christian, and the Romans started to slowly convert over to Christianity because they followed the emperor's example. The area, including the land of Israel, continued to be known by this name. And there are even books referring to the land of Israel before 1948 by this name, because that's how it was known in textbooks, or that's how it was known in maps. And that was actually the land, that was the name Palestine. So Yehudi, as well as writing the lesson plans, put together a series of videos. And these series of videos are intended to help young people understand the situation in Israel. And I'm going to show you one of these where she has a conversation, if you will, where she discusses the view of the Arab Palestinian people. And this is something that can be incorporated into lessons.
Good evening, Mr. Dummy. Oh, good evening, and welcome to our 5th installment of A Dummy's View On. So how are you? Oh, I'm always well, thank you, and how are you? Well, I'm very confused again. Oh dear, what now? Well, I took a look at the charter of the Palestine Liberation Organization again. You know, they're recognized as the sole representative of the Palestinian people. Yes, and what confuses you? Well, over and over again it says we, the Palestinian Arab people. And then I looked at, here I brought it for you to see. This is from the Palestinian National Charter, Article 1, from July 17, 1968, so this was their revised charter, Article 1. Look at what it says. Palestine is the homeland of the Arab Palestinian people. It is an indivisible part of the Arab homeland, and the Palestinian people are an integral part of the Arab nation. Yes, I'm familiar with that. And so what else? Well, and then I remembered, here I brought this again as well. The Hamas Minister of Interior and National Security, Fatih Hamad, said on Egyptian TV, I couldn't believe it. This is a memory translation. We all have Arab roots, and every Palestinian in Gaza and throughout Palestine can prove his Arab roots, whether from Saudi Arabia, from Yemen, or anywhere. Who are the Palestinians? We are Arabs. We are Muslims. All right, so what's the problem? Well, if they're part of the Arab people, then we know that they came from the Arabian Peninsula, not from the area of the land of Israel, correct? And also, we know when the Arabs and the Muslims invaded the land of Israel and the area and made it part of the Arab Muslim empire, and that was in the year 638, which was about 2,000 years after the Jewish people returned to their land after the Egyptian slavery. All right, so what's your point? Well, on one hand, they say that they're part of the Arab people, and we know the Arab people came from the Arabian Peninsula. And on the other hand, they say that they're a separate people and they need their own country. Huh, I see why you're confused. Am I the only one? The sole representative of the Palestinian people have said that they're part of the Arab nation. And the Arabs have 21 countries. There's only one tiny Jewish country in the whole world. So why do people call from the creation of yet another Arab country called Palestine on the very land of the Jewish people? And then what's even more confusing, here I brought another quote from the Palestine National Charter. This is Article 12. The Palestinian people believe in Arab unity. In order to contribute their share toward the attainment of that objective, however, they must, at the present stage of their struggle, safeguard their Palestinian identity and develop their consciousness of that identity and impose any plan that may dissolve or impair it. Like, what does this mean? That the Palestinian identity is only temporary? Well, actually, Zuhair Hussein, who is the executive member of the Palestine Liberation Organization, said it even more clearly. I actually just happened to bring that quote, and it's here on the table. Okay, let me get it for you. Do you want to read it? No, you can read it. Okay, here it is. Zuhair Hussein, executive member of the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization. The Palestinian people does not exist. The creation of a Palestinian state is only a means for continuing our struggle against the state of Israel for our Arab unity. Only for political and tactical reasons do we speak today about the existence of a Palestinian people. Well, I can't believe this. So they themselves are saying that it's all a hoax, it's just temporary to try and defeat the Jews this way? Well, that's what they're saying in their own words. Look, if people really want to help a homeless people regain their land, why don't they go and try and help the Kurdish people? The Kurdish people have been trying to regain their homeland, Kurdistan, for so many years. And why don't they help the Yazidi people? They have been massacred, their women and slaves, their women and young girls are still taken as sex slaves. Let them help them. That calling for the creation of yet another 22nd Arab country on the very land of the one Jewish state has only one purpose. So what is that purpose? To destroy Israel and the Jewish people. Look it up. If it ain't true, I'm not a dummy.
Okay, so there's just an example of some of the information and some of the ways that you can pass it along to your students, to your audience. So what we learned from that, some of the issues, some of the facts that we learned from there is that it's recorded that Arabs in the past totally rejected the name Palestine. They decided that it was a creation of the Zionist movement, and it wasn't part of it. A local Arab leader, Abd al-Mahdi, testified before the Peel Commission in 1937 as follows. He said, "There is no such land. Palestine is a term invented by the Zionists. There is no Palestine in the Bible. Our land was for hundreds of years a part of Syria." So if they're talking about a part of Syria and they say there's no Palestine, then how can there be Palestinian people? Further, we have in 1956, Ahmed Shukari, the Arab League's ambassador to the UN, proclaimed, "Such a creature as Palestine does not exist at all. This land is nothing but the southern portion of Greater Syria." So we're talking about part of Syria. We're not talking about what they claim is Palestine and what some people will claim is Palestine. So, you know, we can't have historically, when I talked before about continuity and getting that through to people, you can't say to people, this is something that's consistent, that consistently there's been a denial of the land of Palestine and of Palestinian people, and there's been an attempt to say that they're Arab Palestinians when that really isn't true. There is certainly the Arab people, but there was never anything such as Arab Palestinians until very relatively recently. You know, and we saw in the ADUMI, we heard a mention of the tiny little country of Israel. When we look at it, Israel is 1/8 of 1% of the Middle East. That's it, this tiny little spot. And we have all these nations that surround it that are, I mean, are obviously at the very best of times, grudgingly accept that Israel exists. And at the worst of times, openly attack and attempt to militarily take over Israel. And make no mistake, what's happening now by a lot of people who are surrounding Israel and by a lot of people who are involved in this effort to destroy Israel, this is an attack. It's just an attack of a different kind, based on lies and based on, you know, revising history and untruths. So why do people in the West accept this? Well, in the West, you know, what we call the Western world, we like to root for the underdog. There's a proud history of standing up for those who are oppressed, for those who are you know, in difficult situations. And what the narrative has been constructed and created, that's what Israel is doing to the Palestinian people, is they are causing them harm, they are attacking them, they are subjugating them to subhuman conditions, all of which is simply not true. But there are many people in the West who are not critical about their thinking. They don't look for the truth there. And they see Israel as a Goliath who's picking on a David, ironically. And they have this need to stand up and support the underdog. So there are certain groups among the Arab people who have appropriated the name Palestine and invented an Arab Palestine. We know Palestine was coined, the term was coined by the Roman Emperor Hadrian. It had nothing to do with the Arab people. So why would this happen now? And we know that people in the West still knew this area by the name Palestine. So, we said even up until and as close as 1948, there were still many people calling the territory Palestine. So the world knew the name of Palestine. And by calling themselves Palestinians, what it did was it created the thinking in people's minds that these were people who were the original inhabitants of the area. I can call myself, whatever I like. I can call myself a Torontonian if I come from Winnipeg. And if I say it enough, people are just going to accept it. They're going to accept that I was born here, where I may not have. Obviously it's not the same thing, but we're talking about the power of words and putting a perception in people's minds when you use the words. So when you take someone who knows that this particular area is called by a certain name, and they say, yeah, that's part of my identity, that's part of who I am, even though it's not true, people tend to think about it and they associate those with that area. Palestine is actually a non-Arabic name. It came from the Romans. It's not an Arabic word. And why would the Palestinians name the land something and themselves something that doesn't appear in the Arab language? As a matter of fact, there's no P sound in the Arabic language. The Arab alphabet does not have a P sound. There's an attempt to present Jews as newcomers, and there are claims that they stole the land from the Palestinians. How can you steal a land from people who were never in possession of it in the first place? And there was no mention of the Palestinian people until close to 20 years after the establishment of the modern state of Israel. We're talking mid to late 60s. That's the first time we ever heard of any Palestinian people. So how is that possible that 20 years later, almost 20 years later, that we're hearing now about it, and everybody accepts the fact that these people were there for so long, preceding the establishment of a state of Israel in 1948, and going back thousands of years in history when the Jewish people were living in the land of Israel, and there was no mention in the Bible, there was no mention in documentation, in books, in any kind of records of a Palestinian people until around 20 years after the establishment of the state of Israel. That's where that particular, excuse me, again, I'm having technical issues. That's where that particular lesson ends in the lesson plans. And again, we want to establish what did we get out of this. And I apologize, it's a little bit blurry, this slide. It's not your eyes, it's not your computer. It's actually the image I did not realize was a little fuzzy there. But in this case, I'm just showing you another example of summing up for the day. And here we have, it's called a 3-2-1. So it's another form of exit ticket. And really, you just ask your audience or you ask your students, quickly take some time and jot down 3 things I learned today. What can you use from this? Well, that tells you how effective your teaching was and what your audience got out of your teaching. Maybe you need to change a few things. We're always constantly looking and reflecting on whether what we used and the methods that we used and how we conveyed our information work so that we can fix it for next time. So this is one way you can get that feedback. 2 things I found interesting. You look for those common elements from your audience. Those might be things that you want to focus on for the next time. And then one question I still have, because we always have questions that may not have been answered throughout the presentation. And speaking of questions, I'm just going to take a quick look. Okay, so when we're looking at feedback, it's often easier for people to give feedback written than to come up to you and say something and ask you a question directly. So this can be very useful, not just even during a presentation or even during a seminar. It doesn't have to be in a classroom setting. Okay, so it doesn't appear, I just checked with Agnes Imani, who's our communications person. She's also the founder of Jews Against Anti-Semitism Canada and is very involved in CILR. So she's actually monitoring for questions, and we don't seem to have any questions at the moment. So, you know, if you have any questions, if you think of anything that you want to ask in the next couple of minutes while I'm summing up, please feel free. You can even go in the chat or the Q&A and you can pose your questions. And I just want to extend a thanks once again to all the members of the CILR Education Committee who've put in you know, a lot of effort in reviewing and contributing to the formulation of the 2 webinars that we put on. If you are interested in seeing more webinars along these lines, you know, please let us know. I'm going to have that information for you on the final slide. And then again, this will be available on Facebook Live. It'll be available recorded on the JTeach.ca videos page, for which I'll give you the link as well. We also have a number of consultants that were part of you know, the feedback process and involved in giving us some crucial information in order for us to be able to bring these webinars to you. So as we've established, there really aren't any questions at the moment, but that's okay. You can always send in. You'll have my email at the end, and you'll have Goldie's email at the end, and you can always send emails to us and communicate with us that way. We will be developing a Q&A document. There were a bunch of questions that were posed during the first seminar that we did not have a chance to address, and we'll make sure to put together a document with not only questions and answers to those questions, but with some links to related sites that have to deal with the topics that we're discussing with the Jewish people's rights to the land of Israel, and so that you can continue, again, like we said all along, to educate yourself and know the facts about what's happening in Israel today and how the Jewish people have the right to the land of Israel. So, you know, just some housekeeping stuff and some final stuff, but I want to let you know that you are welcome to a free copy of Yehudi Shire Weisberg's lesson plans. You can email Goldie Steiner. Her email is at the bottom of the screen. It's goldie@israelslegalrights.org. So you're welcome to do that. Email her for that. For information on Israel Truth Week, you can go to israeltruthweek.org, or you can email Mark at israeltruthweek.org, and you can ask him any questions. He's very knowledgeable about the situation. He's done countless trainings for individuals about the mandate for Palestine and representing Jews as owners of the land of Israel and not occupiers. So please go to his website. And he's also an official lecturer for Canadians for Israel Legal Rights, in addition to israeltruthweek.org. Salomon Benzimra's book, The Jewish People's Rights to the Land of Israel, is available on Amazon, or you can contact Goldie Steiner if you have. And then before we sign off, there are a couple questions, so we're gonna do that once I get through this page. If you're interested in more webinars or seminars, like I said, please reach out to us via emails. And this is the, if you want to take a screenshot or you want to take a picture of this screen, so you have the link to the video page on JTeach.ca, you can actually see a recording of this video and the previous session as well. And there's the contact information and emails. I'm going to invite, we do have 2 questions. Agnes has just informed me, and I am, so I'm going to ask Agnes to join us so that she can share these questions with us, which I believe she can do by turning on her own video. Once she does that, she will be able to join us.
Hi, Corey. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Agnes.
Can you hear me? All right, so we've got a couple great questions here. Where do the Arabs who call themselves Palestinians go?
Well,
what do we do with them?
Offers from other countries. First of all, Israel has never claimed that they want to remove anyone from territories or from their homes. I mean, if we look at the state of Israel, and we look at a map of Israel, and we look at the amount of Arabs who are citizens of Israel, live within the country and within the borders, there's a significant population there. It's not as if Israel has always said that the only people who can live here are Jews. There are many Christians. If we look at just even Jerusalem, if we look at the Old City, there's an Armenian quarter, there's a Muslim quarter, there's a Jewish quarter. So we have all kinds of people who are living together or living in a concentrated area and peacefully getting along for the most part. It seems like those who are the most upset about it are people who are outside of the situation, looking in, who are saying to people that this is not an acceptable situation and this is not something that should be happening. But the truth is that Israel's not looking to displace or, as we hear from certain people, push the people there into the sea. They're looking to maintain their legal right to have Israel as an established homeland. CILR, Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights.org, is not a political party. It's not a government agency. It's an NGO. Really what we're seeking to do through these seminars is simply to establish that Israel has a legal right to live in that land. What the government chooses to do and how they choose to negotiate with others is their choice. They are the politicians. They are the government of the land. But it has to be recognized that they're doing so from a position of ownership, not from a position as occupier. We look very differently upon people if we convince the world that we don't have the right to that particular land, then it really puts us in a weak position in order to negotiate with others. And I can't understand why people they can't separate the fact that just stating that first we need to negotiation. We need that foundation. Before we start to negotiate, we need to establish that Israel has the legal right to exist and they have the legal right to be there. And that's what CILR is attempting to do, is to educate people to the fact that, again, that we are owners and not occupiers. We have another question.
Thank you, Corey. Here's another question. Why do Israelis refer to them as the Palestinians instead of calling them Arabs?
Well, it's a good choice. I mean, it's a good question. I guess the simplest answer would be is that through negotiation and through treaties, the government has determined or decided to hand over for what was formerly known as the Gaza Strip to a government that has deemed themselves to be called the Palestinians. I think it's really along the lines of me saying this is we change cities all the time. We have the city of Gatineau, which borders Ontario and Quebec, and it used to be called Hull. The government there and the government in the area decided we're going to be called Gatineau. Well, that's how we refer to it, and a big part of that is actually respect for the people who are living there and respect for the government that is in power there, that we agree as a people and Israel agrees as a people to refer to it as Palestine. It's not an acceptance or an admission that there's some sort of historical background or ownership of the entire country. It's that the negotiated territory, that negotiated piece of land was negotiated to be handed over to the Arab people who have decided to designate that territory and call it Palestine. And it's really as simple as that.
Thank you, Corey. It seems like that's all for the questions.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, like I said, we want to thank everybody, and thank you, Agnes, for moderating those questions for us. There was a lot of people who were part of making this. There are a lot of people who continue to be part of CILR as advisors or as participants or committee members. And anyone who's out there who's interested, we want to invite you as well to communicate with us. There's again, you can reach Goldie through Israel's Legal Rights.org or myself through JTeach.ca. And if you are interested in us continuing with these, please let us know, and we'll be happy to look into it. So thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Thank you.